Get started. We'll see who else might show up. Okay, so for next week, we're going to be reading Clement Greenberg and also about Clement Greenberg. So we're going to be dealing with Marxist art criticism and in a few different respects. So we'll read 3 articles by Clement Greenberg: Avant-Garde and Kitsch, Towards a Newer Laocoon, and Modernist Painting. Then there's a classic debate between T.J. Clark and Michael Fried about Greenberg. And as a kind of parallel phenomenon, we'll look at Meyer Shapiro's essay on the nature of abstract art. So T.J. Clark was a student of Meyer Shapiro, and Michael Fried was a student of Greenberg. And T.J. Clark is a kind of a socialist, anarchist, art historian and art critic, whereas Michael Fried goes from Greenberg to more phenomenological approach to art. So we'll be switching gears again back to visual art. Any volunteers for next time? Okay.
I have a question. Can I go specific for like the nature of abstract art?
Okay, if you want to, yeah. So you guys could coordinate so that you divide up. Yeah, no problem. All right. So for today, we have a bunch of readings by Adorno. We're going to focus on a couple in particular, and really one above all, and that is the fetish-character in music and the regression of listening. But let's start off with the social situation of music. So these are the 2 long essays that we read for today, and for which I provided a lot of examples of music to listen to. All right, well, let's just look at the beginning of this piece in particular, because it will help us kind of programmatically see how Adorno is approaching music, but also it will be an example of the kind of critical theory that we've been engaging last week and will continue to engage next time with Greenberg. All right, so who's Adorno? Let me first mention that. So Adorno is a friend of Siegfried Kracauer, who we read last week, also a friend and protege of Walter Benjamin. So Kracauer and Benjamin a little bit older. Benjamin considers Adorno to be his only student. Adorno a little bit younger. Adorno is about 10 years younger than them. But Adorno is a musician. He's himself a musician. And he studied with Alban Berg in Vienna, basically in the milieu of what's known as the Second Viennese School. So that's Arnold Schoenberg, Anton Webern, and Alban Berg. They're the sort of troika, excuse me, of modernist, high modernist composers. So he was there in the 1920s studying with them, and he continued to engage music throughout his life, Adorno. This is an early piece by him, one of the first pieces he wrote for publication. It's also a talk that he gave. So he writes, "No matter where music is heard today, it sketches in the clearest possible lines the contradictions and flaws which cut through present-day society. At the same time, music is separated from this same society by the deepest of all flaws produced by the society itself. And yet society is unable to absorb more of this music than its ruins and external remains. The role of music in the social process is exclusively that of a commodity. Its value is that determined by the market. Music no longer serves direct needs nor benefits from direct application, but rather adjusts to the pressures of the exchange of abstract units. Its value, wherever such value still exists at all, is determined by use. It subordinates itself to the process of exchange. The islands of pre-capitalist music making, such as the 19th century could still tolerate, have been washed away. The techniques of radio and sound film in the hands of powerful monopolies and in unlimited control over the total capitalistic propaganda machine have taken possession of even the innermost cell of musical practices of domestic music making. Even in the 19th century, the possibility of the domestic cultivation of music, like the entirety of bourgeois private life, represented only the reverse side of a social corpus whose surface was totally determined by production through private capital. The dialectic of capitalistic development has further eliminated even this last immediacy offered by music, in itself already an illusion, for in it the balance between individual production and understanding by society was threatened. Since Wagner's Tristan, this balance has been totally destroyed. Through the total absorption of both musical production and consumption by the capitalistic process, the alienation of music from man has become complete. All right, so let's unpack some of this. So we talked about use value and exchange value. We talked about the commodity form. Okay, so he's using that language here of use value and exchange value. So he says apparently two completely contradictory things, like right juxtaposed to each other, that music's value is totally determined by exchange and it's totally determined by use. Okay. But let's back up a second before we get to the use value, exchange value, dichotomy or antinomy or contradiction. First, he says contradictions and flaws which cut through present-day society, and that music, no matter where it's heard, exemplifies this. So kind of starts out very subtly implying that it's not the music itself, it's the hearing of it, meaning it's the listener. This is an important point. It's the listener that makes music into what it is. Now, of course, the listener is also the musician. So all musicians are listeners first before they make music. So the consumer becomes the producer. The producer is first a consumer. Okay. Now, he says at the same time, music is separated from the same society by the deepest of all flaws produced by the society itself. So one way of thinking about the self-contradiction of society and capitalism is to look at this separation or contradiction between art and life. Here, music and life. So music is part of society, art is part of society, and yet we do perceive a division between art and society, and that itself has to be understood as a self-contradiction of society. We'll see that it's also a self-contradiction of art. So the contradiction between art and life is also a contradiction within art and a contradiction within life in capitalism. Now he brings up pre-capitalistic music making. So bourgeois music making, but pre-capitalistic music making. He talks about the domestic sphere. One of the sets of readings that we did for today has to do with the medium of sound recording. So the form of the phonograph record, the curves of the needle. Right. So that is what we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks, the form of mass distribution of music in the 20th century, in the late 19th and 20th century, but especially in the 20th century. Before that, what was the form of the mass distribution of music in the form of the score, meaning mass printing of music. The reproduction of music meant the playing of music by people. So that's when he brings up the domestic sphere of music. So how music was consumed was actually tied to its production. So people would buy sheet music and they'd play it, sing it at home. That was how popular music, that's how classical music was distributed on a mass basis. So he calls that this sort of last moment before sound recording kind of takes over. So he thinks that that's an important transition. And yet, even that, mass distribution of music in the form of the score and in the form of consumption as domestic production, even that's already exemplified this contradiction in capitalism. Okay, so how and why might that be the case? So before that, music was a commodity. It was a kind of artisanal commodity. So it's not a mass-produced or mass-consumed commodity. Still might have been a commodity, but not in the sense that we experience it in capitalism. Whether in the early phase, sheet music, or in the late phase, sound recording. So the early phase, sheet music, still suggests a kind of a bourgeois public sphere, a bourgeois individual, a bourgeois subject who's capable of playing music. So that idea of, again, the connection between music and life, there would have been much more of a direct connection. Whereas with sound recording, there seems to be this complete alienation of production from consumption. So production and consumption were more integral to each other in the era of sheet music distribution. This will be important when we do the fetish character in music in the regression of listening, because even then the score takes on a different character. In other words, when musical scores go from being something that could be popularly consumed, popularly used to make music, to being extremely technical in character so that only professional musicians can really read and use scores to perform. That's in the 20th century. Right? I mean, in part, what we're talking about is what makes the piece of music. What is music? Before sound recording, to be heard, music had to be performed live. Right, so something that we completely take for granted now is that we can experience music apart from a live performance of it. There was a time when the only way you could experience music was through a live performance. Does that suggest any difference? He thinks so. So if we go back to one of the kind of main thought figures we've been dealing with in terms of art becoming art, music becoming music. It's in the Renaissance era, it's in the emergence of bourgeois society, it's in the hundreds of years leading up to the 19th and 20th centuries of capitalism, that art, and in this case music, liberates itself from its traditional role, its traditional place. So in its traditional place, you would have had folk music, you would have had court music of the aristocracy, and you would have had church music. Now what happened was folk music became bourgeois popular music. So the music of the peasants became the music of the bourgeoisie, the urban population, the working class. A little bit of a difference there. There's a transformation of who the common people are. The traditional folk become the modern population. And then in the 19th and 20th century become the masses. And so part of what's going on here is that he's going to try to trace that development by indexing it to changes in music, in the way music is consumed and in the way it's produced. We'll see that Mozart has an important pivot point for Adorno. Mozart, there's a film that actually depicts this, Amadeus. If you guys have seen that movie, Amadeus, it's kind of a cute film. And so he's sort of, it's a complicated film. So he was a musical prodigy as a young boy, and he was kind of exploited, abused by his father to be like a performing child, the way any like child prodigy is taken advantage of by their parents. And then he grew up to be a very important musician who composed for both the church and the court, but then he also produced music composed for commercial venues. All right, so the magic flute is, for Adorno, this kind of moment at which music in the bourgeois sense, in the sense of a commodity, but also in the sense of a kind of identity with society, in this popular bourgeois society sense of a commercial product that is nonetheless accessible to the masses. Right. So, however, like if you see the film Amadeus, nonetheless, Mozart thought of the different kinds of composition he was doing, the different kind of work, the different kind of music he was creating, to be different. Like, religious music is different from court music, is different from popular entertainment music. Now, I mention that only because we've previously discussed the sort of phases of art history that we're tracing in the course. So, we have our classical to romantic modernist phases. So, classical in the realm of music, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to describe it as Mozart to Beethoven. And then Beethoven, late Beethoven kind of gets you into Romanticism. At the end of this first paragraph, on the social situation of music, he says, Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. Okay, so who's the modernist? Who's the first modernist musician? Wagner. So there's something extraordinary about what happens to music between Mozart and Wagner. So classical in the realm of music, classical tonality music based on natural harmonies, and also kind of pure natural harmonies. So the move from harpsichord to piano, right? The simplification of sonority. Piano is a kind of purer sound, more appropriate to the natural harmonics of classical tonality. And so whereas the harpsichord is sort of rich in sonorities and still has too much of the flavor of the Baroque. And that seems to modern ears to sound more kind of antique, or not merely old-fashioned, but sort of idiomatic, kind of cultural in a way that, again, classical music, because it's based on classical tonality, has this kind of natural, almost scientific, rational character to it. Whereas everything that comes before seems still steeped in a kind of traditional idiom and evokes kind of traditional cultural practices that music was embedded in. Now Wagner seems to be, after Romanticism, to be a kind of complete change in music as an art form. And that's why it's the beginning of modernism. For instance, overthrowing, liquidating the sonata form. So the sonata form is a form of musical exposition that is tied to this kind of bourgeois notion of art. So we talked last time about art as enlightening, so that the task of art is to enlighten the viewer or the listener or the reader, to educate them about the medium, about the genre. So every piece of music is a little education in music listening. And so it's actually tied to the idea that every listener could be a creator of music. Every viewer of painting could become a painter. Every reader of fiction could become a fiction writer. So the almost technical education in the experience of the work of art is connected to a larger enlightenment or education about the world and also about one's own capacities as a aesthetic subject, like one's own capacities to make sense out of aesthetic experience and aesthetic form. So Wagner, who does the sort of unchained melody and the leitmotif, really is modernist in the sense of expressing a kind of a crisis of this listening subject, and is this even music anymore? So Nietzsche raised the question of whether Wagner is even making music anymore, or is he rather doing something else? And we also associate Wagner with his operas and the total work of art, right? That's a kind of dramatic work as well as a kind of visual production. So Wagner did everything. He wrote the libretto, he wrote the music, he did the stage production, he set design, he did the whole thing. He even created a special place ultimately for all of his works to be produced, where people had to sort of make a pilgrimage there to see his productions. Right, so that's in some ways the opposite of the immediate accessibility of music, where you could get a score and reproduce it at home. Right, in that sense, Wagner's modernism is almost like a reinstallation of the traditional place of music, which is that you had to sort of be there for it to be what it was. You had to be in the church for the religious music to make sense. You had to be in the court for the aristocratic music to make sense. You had to be among the people in the village for the folk music to make sense. So when art, or in this case music, becomes a commodity, it becomes a kind of portable, reproducible experience that has a kind of popular democratic character that already collapses by the middle of the 19th century, by the middle of the 1800s. So Wagner, in particular, is a case, as Nietzsche put it. He was himself a revolutionary in 1848. He was himself we talked a bit about Cutrone. We read Marx's 1844 manuscripts, the Paris manuscripts, the economic and philosophic manuscripts, the critique of Proudhon, who's the most prominent socialist in France, but also in the world in the 1840s, and who's also the father of anarchism. Wagner was a Proudhonian socialist, and he was a political radical, and he took part in the revolutions of 1848, and the German Revolution in particular, as did Marx and Engels. And he was bitterly disappointed by the outcome of the revolution. And his music is actually meant to be a critique of modern capitalist society. So the Ring Cycle is about the struggle against the rule of gold. Right, but in this kind of highly mythologized form. Right, and he kind of creates his own kind of mythos. It's kind of like a Tolkien, right, or like Frank Herbert, like Dune, It's kind of like creates his whole universe that he writes his operas for, ultimately. And then, of course, Adorno's writing before the Nazi seizure of power here in the social situation of music, but Wagner is a favorite of the Nazis. And that's because, like a lot of people coming out of 1848, he blamed the failure of the revolution on the Jews. He was an anti-Semite. Okay. All of this to say that the collapse of bourgeois society and its kind of democratic, cosmopolitan Enlightenment spirit, Adorno is going to tie into the aesthetic form of music itself. Okay. Let's jump ahead here. I'm going to jump a little bit ahead to because he sort of addresses what Lukács described as reification and rationalization, the rationalization of music. But let's jump to this page. It says, the question is further to what degree music, insofar as it might intervene in the social process, will be in a position to intervene as art. So, by the way, Wagner also wrote essays about politics and art, politics and music in particular. Just a side note. And next time when we read Greenberg, Avant-Garde and Kitsch, Greenberg will talk about the relationship between the artistic avant-garde and the political avant-garde, and how that sort of has this kind of focal point circa 1848, but then they take different paths after 1848. Regardless of the answers which might be given, Adorno writes, here and now, music is able to do nothing but portray within its own structure the social antinomies which are also responsible for its own isolation. So remember Trotsky in The Art and Politics in Our Epoch, written some years later, but nonetheless speaking in the same spirit, says that art can't really change society, can't really do anything, but it can register a protest against reality. So we'll see in what way. Music will be better, Adorno writes, the more deeply it is able to express, in the antinomies of its own formal language, the exigency of the social condition, and to call for change through the coded language of suffering. It is not for music to stare in helpless horror at society. It fulfills its social function more precisely when it presents social problems through its own material and according to its own formal laws, problems which music contains within itself in the innermost cells of its technique. The task of music as art thus enters into a parallel relationship to the task of social theory. So, if you recall from the first week of class, the Susan Buckmore's, artist's work is to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience, and the critic's work is to recognize this. Right, so again, the parallel task. But also in another part of that same essay by Buckmore, she said that theory, like art, should bring to consciousness what was previously only dimly perceived. Right, and exemplify, right, the most fundamental social problems of our time, is the way she put it. So, if the imminent development of music were established as an absolute, Adorno writes, as the mere reflection of the social process, the only result would be a sanction of the fetish character of music, which is the major difficulty and most basic problem to be represented by music today. And we'll get into that in more detail in the other essay. On the other hand, it is clear that music is not to be measured in terms of the existing society of which it is the product, and which at the same time keeps music in a state of isolation. It is the prerequisite of every historical materialistic method which hopes to be more than a mere exercise in intellectual history, that under no conditions is music to be understood as a spiritual phenomenon, abstract and far removed from actual social conditions, which can anticipate through its imagery any desire for social change independently from the empirical realization thereof. It thus becomes obvious that the relation of present-day music and society is highly problematic in all its aspects. This relation shares its aporias with social theory. At the same time, however, it shares the attitudes which this theory expresses, or ought to express, towards these aporias. In a certain sense, the character of cognition is to be demanded of any music which today wishes to preserve its right to existence. Through its material, music must give clear form to the problems assigned it by this material, which is itself never purely natural material. By that he means purely historical material, but rather a social and historical product. Solutions offered by music in this process stand equal to theories. So it's meant to, what we've talked about, point beyond the current situation. It's not supposed to just exemplify the current situation, but also point beyond it. And it points beyond it by embodying the contradictions. Social postulates are offered, the relationship of which to praxis might be, to be sure, extremely mediated and difficult, or which at any rate cannot be realized without great difficulty. It is these postulates, however, which decide whether and how the entrance into social reality might be made. The short circuit: such music is incomprehensible, esoteric, private, thus reactionary, and must therefore be rejected. Such music is constructed upon the foundation of a romantic concept of primitive musical immediacy, which gives rise to the opinion that the empirical consciousness of present-day society, a consciousness promoted in unenlightened narrow-mindedness, and indeed promoted even to the point of neurotic stupidity in the face of class domination for the purpose of the preservation of this consciousness, might be taken as the positive measure of a music no longer alienated, but rather the property of free men. Politics must not be permitted to draw abstractions from the state of consciousness, which is necessarily of central concern to the social dialectic, nor is cognition to allow the definition of its boundaries by a consciousness produced by class domination, and which further, as the class consciousness of the proletariat, extends the wounds of mutilation by means of the class mechanism. Music is under the same obligation as theory to reach out beyond the current consciousness of the masses. All right, so he's saying there is already emerging at this time a condemnation of modernist music as esoteric, private, incomprehensible, reactionary in the sense of divorced from society. But then he's saying the alternative would be, apparently, it would be to make music that's immediately consonant with, or at least resonating with, the consciousness of the masses as they are. And he's saying, but the whole point is that we have to get beyond the current state of consciousness of the masses. So there's a little bit of a contradiction or paradox here. Theory, he says, however, stands in a dialectic relation to praxis, upon which it makes its demands and from which it also accepts demands. In the same manner, music, which has achieved self-consciousness of its social function, will enter into a dialectic relation to praxis. This is to be achieved not through the self-subordination of music to use, which it could do here and now only through definition of itself as a commodity, and which would grant it only an illusion of immediacy, but rather by developing within music itself, in agreement with the state of social theory, all those elements whose objective is the overcoming of class domination. This music must do even where this development takes place in social isolation, confined to the cells of music during the period of class domination. It might be possible for the most advanced compositional production of the present, solely under the pressure of the imminent development of its problems, to invalidate basic bourgeois categories, such as creative personality and expression of the soul of this personality, the world of private feelings and its transfigured inwardness, setting in their place highly rational and transparent principles of construction. Remember what we read from Benjamin, the experience in poverty, where he talked about the will to the tabula rasa and the positive notion of barbarism as constructing. Even this music, however, would remain dependent upon bourgeois production processes and could not consequently be viewed as classless or the actual music of the future, but rather as music which fulfills its dialectic cognitive function most exactly. Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. Right, so a dialectic relation to praxis. So again, he's restating what he started out with, the contradiction between art and life, or the contradiction between music and life. Right, that it has to sort of thematize this rather than try to avoid it, rather than try to short circuit or immediately overcome the contradiction between art and life. Okay, so he ends up in this piece of dividing music. Along two axes of contradiction. Subjective versus objective, and individual versus collective. And he kind of plots out all the music of his time into these four zones. But really the point is that all the music is riven by these contradictions. So all the music is more or less riven by these two sets of ways of describing its self-contradiction, subjective versus objective, and individual versus collective. Now, what I'll say about, he invokes Arnold Schoenberg, who's the sort of leading composer of the Second Viennese School, where he studied, and also Stravinsky. And with Schoenberg, there's an irony, because his music, like if you read present-day criticism, like when there's a Schoenberg performance, it's described as intellectual, cerebral, formal. However, Schoenberg himself, he not only wrote music and made music, but he also was a painter. He was an expressionist. So Schoenberg is like Edvard Munch, except in music. And his painting is a little bit Edvard Munch as well. So he's an expressionist, and in fact, a lot of his formal technical innovations in music were driven by a desire to represent psychological states, feelings that he felt could not be exemplified in music according to traditional technique. Right, so in that respect, it would appear that Schoenberg is individualistic. He's very much concerned with this kind of interior psychology of the individual, and also very subjectivistic. Nonetheless, he produced atonality and then eventually 12-tone, and we'll see the transition from atonality, free atonality, to 12-tone for Adorno is like a betrayal. Like pre-World War I, atonality, post-World War I, 12-tone. And it's like a kind of attempt to systematize what was previously an attempt to free the capacities of music, to express, again, expressionism. Now, Stravinsky, on the other hand, now there are different phases of Stravinsky's career as well, but one of the things that that unites them in Adorno's mind is his primitivism and his collectivism, right? So, and neoclassicism, right? So there are different phases in Stravinsky's career, nonetheless, and Stravinsky sort of arrives at different places on that map at different points in his career, but there is something, a tendency opposite to Schoenberg, where he tries to kind of create modern music out of like Russian folk themes, and also through a kind of strange pastiche of the classical. Right, so that would be more on the objective and collective side, rather than on the individual and subjective side. He also talks about jazz, and he talks about what he calls use music. Use music, which is music that's attempting to like serve the people, serve the masses, and is associated with the political left, whether social democratic or communist. And jazz, which is of particular concern to Adorno, because especially after World War I, jazz is all the rage, is very popular. And so jazz in the realm of music, very similar to some of the things discussed by Krakauer in the Mass Ornament, or by Benjamin with respect to the Bauhaus aesthetic, which we'll come back to when we read Benjamin's author as producer in a few weeks. So really the point is how music is divided against itself along these axes. Because, of course, society is both individual and collective. And of course, art and subjectivity, reality, is also subjective and objective. Like those are kind of, these are all dimensions of reality. You can't have one without the other. There is no objective without the subjective. There's no individual without the collective. There's no collective without the individual. So it's really about the relation of these things. And again, Lukács's reification essay, the relation of these things with respect to a dialectical interplay becoming instead an antinomical separation. Right, so that in reification, you have the reification of the subjective, so you have subjectivism. You have a reification of the objective, you have objectivism. You have a reification of the individual, you have individualism. And you also have a reification of the collectivism. Whereas in bourgeois society, as an emancipation of social relations, it was this free interplay of the subjective, objective, and the individual and the collective. Meaning, no longer the traditional way of relating the subjective and the objective, or the traditional way of relating the individual and the collective. Now, how was that emancipation carried out in bourgeois society? Through the commodity relations of labor. Meaning production was freed in this way. Everything became a commodity. So production was taken out of its traditional context and opened up so that everyone could participate in any kind of production. One was not limited to one form of production from birth, the way it was the case with peasants or with artisans, with the caste system. So in the caste system, social production is confined to set social status of individuals. They can't change jobs, and they also can't innovate in production either. Right, so commodification means the liberation of not only the individual, but also the collective possibilities of society. Which allows for, in Adorno's view, a more critical experience of the world, of oneself, and of forms, like aesthetic forms. It allows for a more critical experience of music, for example. One doesn't just experience it in an embedded cultural way, but what Benjamin will describe later in the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, it goes from having a cult value to having an exhibition value. Right? And how does it achieve that? By becoming a commodity. However, in capitalism, that commodity dialectic is destroyed, and it's replaced by reification. Again, subjective versus objective, individual versus collective. Okay, so obviously when that happens, it has an effect on art, on music. Now, I'll say something also about music. So we have the plastic arts, painting and sculpture. We have the literary arts, poetry, fiction. We have the dramatic arts and the performing arts. So dramatic arts, stage drama, other kinds of performances, but music. One of the things that makes music interesting for Adorno as a Marxist is that music is not only a dramatic or performing art, and so dramatic art in the form of opera, etc., not just a performing art, it's also a durational art. It's not to say that duration and time are not part of other art forms, they are. So painters do try to form the temporal and durational character of the viewing experience. They do. It's part of what composition is about. However, it's explicitly thematized in the way that Adorno is approaching it. It's explicitly thematized in music. And what that means is what we talked about last week, the aura, presence, space and time, the experience of space and time, photography as exemplifying a crisis of the experience of space and time. That occurs in music. In other words, because in capitalism, time itself, as a social phenomenon, but as individually experienced, time itself goes into self-contradiction and crisis. Our experience of time goes into self-contradiction and crisis. That affects the way we experience music, the way we are able to listen to music. Again, Wagner would be the first registration of that impact. Modernism in music would be a crisis of musical meaning in one key respect because of the way it speaks to and reflects problems in our experience of time. At least in the way that Adorno is thinking about it. Now, I will also say that live performance versus recorded music. So live performance, it's always different every time. And one of the things that a live performer does is play, there is a kind of, at least implicit, more or less explicit, relationship between the audience and the performer, in the same way that like stage acting, there's, the stage actor does respond to the audience, and the musical performer responds to the audience. And so that kind of play of like the time of the performance is also about the presence and the input of the audience. With recorded music, of course, that's not the case, right? So you have a reification of time in recorded music that he thinks is akin to photography. So photography is, again, in comparison to painting, seems to have an objective character. Painting seems subjective by comparison with photography. Photography seems more objective, which is a peculiar thing. Adorno considers recorded music to be the photography of music. That's the way he treats it, the photography of music. Right, so it's a kind of a reified representation of music. So again, that suggests, in the same way that photography suggests a crisis in the way we experience space and time, recorded music seems to express a crisis in the way we experience time. That we want the exact same performance over and over again. That's what having a record is. Having recorded music means that you hear the exact same performance every time. So, of course, you're going to listen to it differently each time. However, the object is going to appear fixed, and the subject will appear variable. And so that destroys the kind of interplay of subject and object. Okay. Another way of thinking about it is, we could say there's yet another, at least implied, axis of contribution, and that would be production and consumption. that's going to be important because when we're getting into mass culture and especially mass distribution of cultural commodities, the production remains individual. The production remains artisanal. Art is still produced artisanally. But it's consumed industrially, meaning it's mass consumed. It's mass distributed. At least in the way that Adorno's approaching it. It's one of the ways that he addresses this situation. So what you have is individual works that are still produced the way they were in bourgeois society as artisanal creations, maybe by small groups of collaborators. But the distribution and consumption is happening at an industrial scale. So if we recall what we read with Wilhelm Reich, the ideological superstructure and the socioeconomic base, right, and the bourgeois social relations and the industrial forces of production, and how they're in contradiction with each other, but that also means that each side of it is in self-contradiction. So art would be part of the ideological superstructure. It would be part of consciousness. It would be part of the bourgeois social relations. So we still have bourgeois art forms. We don't have immediately industrial art forms. However, we try to kind of adjust the bourgeois art form to the industrial conditions, and then what you get is a kind of embodiment of the contradiction between the bourgeois social relations and the industrial forces of production. At least that's the way Adorno thinks about it. We'll see how Benjamin deals with it in the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. So the interesting thing is that the new media like photography and film, it's not like they're on the industrial side and painting is on the bourgeois side. No, it's rather the photography and film and recorded music, but also what happens to live performance music is that it embodies this contradiction between the forces and relations of production, between industrial conditions and bourgeois consciousness, bourgeois practice, bourgeois theory. All right. So hopefully that makes some kind of sense. Like I said, modernism, starting with Wagner in music, exemplifies this problem. This problem manifests. This problem of the antinomies cutting through music manifests. And then different composers, different practitioners handle that problem differently. And all of it would be considered modernism. So next week we'll read avant-garde and kitsch. What will be important for you guys to keep in mind with avant-garde and kitsch is that it's all modernism. Kitsch is modernism, avant-garde is modernism, it's all modernism. Because modernism speaks to the condition of capitalism. That's what it speaks to. It speaks to what happens to bourgeois society in the capitalist epoch. And modernism is one way of getting at that. But modernism not as a solution, but as a kind of embodiment of this crisis. Okay. So I mentioned Mozart. So these commodity music analyzed a series of mini essays, little aphoristic essays on various pieces of music, and they're all quite different from each other, and they also span very different historical periods. So he starts with the Bach, the Ave Maria. So what makes all of these very different kinds of music across different periods of time commodities? What makes all commodity music? It's the listener. They all do refer to music produced in the bourgeois era, so they're all commodities in that sense. But really, more importantly, the problem of music as a commodity is a problem of capitalism, and therefore it's really about the listener under conditions of capitalism, what happens. So that's why he starts off with Bach's Ave Maria, which is basically the musical setting of the Hail Mary, full of grace. Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. Blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. And it's like that. It's like the musical version of that. It becomes what he calls a kind of weird pop pornography, kind of strange object. So it sort of changes its meaning completely in the capitalist era. Okay, so but let's deal with how he addresses this transition from bourgeois music to capitalism through an explicit reference to history. So I mentioned Amadeus. So let's look at what he has to say about Mozart. In an 18th century drawing room, what about Mozart? So if you recall, one of the ways that I described the temporal historical contradiction of capitalism, bourgeois social relations, industrial forces, is 18th century is bourgeois, meaning in the Marxist view that Adorno has, bourgeois society that had developed from the Renaissance onwards came to its own clear self-consciousness, came to consciousness in the late 1700s. And so there's that 18th century reality, so we have the American and French revolutions, we have the Enlightenment, all that good stuff. Then the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, capitalism, and that's one way of thinking about the contradiction of society, is that it has an 18th century reality and it has a 19th century reality, and they're superimposed on each other. All right, so in the United States, next year will be the 250th anniversary of 1776, and God knows how the Art Institute will observe it. But anyway, or if they will at all, the avowed principles of this country are 18th century. Nonetheless, something did clearly happen in the late 19th century after the Civil War, the Gilded Age, when the Industrial Revolution came here. And so ever since then, there's been this basic crisis around the Constitution and politics and the economy and the relation of these things. All right, so this is a theme. What happened to America in the capitalist era? Did it go to hell? And is it still going to hell? The robber barons, right? We have our modern robber barons. We have the tech bros. Right. So the 18th century. So what is the 18th century? What's the image of the 18th century that we have? And Mozart is a window into that. His music neither provides readily marketable emotions, nor does it attempt through any pomp, forcefulness, or power of rhythmic command to induce in the consumer the obedience the latter longs for. Nevertheless, Salzburg is not without its attractions to the tourist. A series of falsifications contrives to tailor Mozart to contemporary taste. To begin with, he is assigned to the Rococo age, whose limits he had just burst asunder. It is a chocolate box Rococo, which has been degraded to stylized women with their hair in a bun, playing the harpsichord by candlelight and complete with silhouette. The Mozartian minuet was little more than the painted ribbon that bound human beings like Figaro, Cherubino, Susanna, and Zerlina to the conventions of their age. Nowadays, history has converted Mozart into the inventor of the minuet. But the transformation of the humanist into a stylish puppet is assisted by his subjective content. The voice that reverberates with feeling is debased into a dainty lament for the Ancien regime. The expressiveness of the Werther decade, that's Goethe, that's The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe, appears as the sentimental reaction of the barbarian to a past dominated by form. Right, so between Mozart and Goethe would be an important sort of transition. Would be from the end of the Ancien regime to revolutionary era. His tunes are an aspect of that barbarism. Oh, excuse me, hit tunes are an aspect of that barbarism, so the reduction of things to a hit tune. They exploit the C major sonata, a children's piece that was a fitting choice. Its simplicity matches the growing infantilism of the listener, and its etude-like scales allow modern barbarians to laugh at the past, for which they yearn, and to pride themselves on how far they have advanced beyond Mozart. The sonatina is gripped by a faith in progress that has now become moronic. 4 bars introduction, a ludicrous pastiche of an old-fashioned mechanical style, then 8 bars of an original Mozart melody, but reharmonized with the turn towards the subdominant. The change has no function. Even the most commonplace needs of pop music scarcely render it necessary. It arises from the sheer pleasure of touching what is forbidden. Nothing in the whole of world history can pass through Tin Pan Alley unscathed. The more you wish to pay homage to the past, the more you reward yourself for doing so, since you have it in your power to rule supreme over the supreme achievements of the past and manipulate them for the greater glory of comfort. There follows the Mozartian scale, which culminates in a sharp blow on the head. Not 1 blow, but 3. In fact, it is knocked out, and the last 2 bars provide a pastiche of the gavotte that is supposed to represent the minuet that was, or rather wasn't, true to Mozart. This is the basis of the middle movement, Genuine Raymond Scott. The recapitulation is preceded by a repeat of the 4 idiotic introductory bars, but they are described as an optional interlude. The editor is, as it were, built into the composition. In the text, the Rococo is projected into a timeless past, in which an old book inherited from an ancestor nevertheless points to a model salon polished to a high gloss. I found it in an old musty book, long lost in some forgotten nook. In the book, a faded picture and the scent of faint perfume, 2 old-fashioned lovers in an 18th century drawing room. So he's quoting a pop song from his time. The gavotte extracts from the archaic drawing room the consolation that nothing new can ever happen again. If things don't get any better now, you at least have the comforting thought that they were no worse even then. Nothing is ever new. Ever since love began, see her 2 eyes of blue flirting behind her fan. Look at his silk and lace, isn't he debonair, and the smile on his face tells of the love they share. The recapitulation concentrates on the seminal moment. Regarding itself as a picture seen through the wrong end of some opera glasses, it finally gives expression to a yearning which, even though it is retrospective, has to be made completely abstract so as to not become too noticeable. The yearning for paradise has degenerated into the yearning for the hit song, which itself feeds on that very yearning. Here their 2 hearts softly beat, 1 moment more and their lips will meet. What a sweet and charming picture, love in glory, love in bloom. Don't you wish that you were in an 18th century drawing room? And then Adorno says, no. Right, so if Mozart embodies a kind of lost past that we yearn for, we still only yearn for it in the form of a capitalist entertainment, right? And a kind of strange nostalgia for the 18th century. So the 18th century, there was another film that was made in the 80s. So Amadeus was made, and then there was The Dangerous Liaisons, which was, because the 18th century, the Enlightenment, this kind of court culture of, bourgeois society of the Anshan regime, because it was bourgeois society under the Anshan regime, was all about these seductions and love affairs and kind of libertine sexuality. Right? And so that seems like some kind of a paradise lost to us now. And Mozart's music seems to be connected with that kind of spirit of play, that mentality of freedom, and yet came to an end. Right? So the revolution brought with it, was supposed to bring with it a kind of official freedom and emancipation, but it ushered in capitalism, and so now we look back and we feel like, oh, we're not able to do that anymore. We're not able to live that way anymore. So that's what the appeal of Mozart is. So I think that when we talked about the the Wilhelm Reich ideology is material force and fascist ideology, that the issue is the appeal. What's the appeal of fascism? What's the appeal of music? What's the appeal of aesthetic pleasure? It's self-contradictory. That's what we have to sort of keep in mind. The appeal is self-contradictory. And last week we had by Krakauer, a way of describing that self-contradiction. Namely, that the appeal of art, including the appeal of music, is contradictory in the sense that it offers both enlightenment and mythologization. So it offers us a enlightenment about our reality, about our situation, but it also offers us a kind of mythologization of that situation and that reality. It does both simultaneously. Let's look at the last section of this. The belief of the popular social psychologists that the film is a dream machine and the happy end, a wish fulfillment, misses the point. The shop girl does not directly identify herself with the glamour girl dressed up as a private secretary who marries the boss. But when faced with this good fortune and overwhelmed by its mere possibility, she ventures to admit to herself what the entire organization of life normally prevents her from admitting, that this good fortune will not be hers. What is taken for the wish fulfillment is the meager liberation which consists in the realization that you do not have to deny yourself the most minimal degree of happiness, namely the knowledge that happiness is not for you, although it might be. The shop girl's experience is like that of the old mother who sheds tears at someone else's wedding, blissfully conscious of the happiness she herself has missed. Even the most stupid people have long since ceased to be fooled by the belief that everyone will win the big prize. The positive element of kitsch lies in the fact that it sets free, for a moment, the glimmering realization that you have wasted your life. All this applies to music with even greater force. Most people listen emotionally. Everything is heard in terms of the categories of late romanticism and of the commodities derived from it, which are already tailored to emotional listening. Their listening is the more abstract, the more emotional it is. Music really only enables them to have a good cry. This is why they love the expression of longing more than happiness itself. The function, for instance, of the standardized Slav melancholy in the musical consumption of the masses is incomparably greater than that of the greatest moments of fulfillment in Mozart or the young Beethoven. The leverage of music, what they call its liberating aspect, is the opportunity to feel something, anything at all. But the content of the feeling is always that of privation. Music has come to resemble the mother who says, "Come and have a good cry, my child." In a sense, it is a kind of psychoanalysis for the masses, but one which makes them, if anything, even more dependent than before. This is no longer quite so easy, not even in music. The more closely you scrutinize the jazz enthusiasts, the more you begin to suspect that it is not enough to have perceived that their behavior is a mere reflex. They are not the mindlessly fascinated people they are claimed to be, and which they see themselves as. A particular act of will is required to submit to an ordained pleasure. You decide to go wild with excitement, just as you decide to have a good time. The identification with the agency which ordains the pleasure functions like this. As ego, you yourself issue the command to enjoy yourself, and then produce the official instinctive reaction only as a rationalization. The model of this behavior is the child who declares, "Today I'm going to be naughty," or the adolescent girl who writes in her diary that she will now get a crush on a particular teacher. The mimetic element in the behavior of all fans, their eagerness to imitate, probably originates in this kind of decision which takes place quite close to the threshold of consciousness. It is the same with humor. The jitterbug is not able to believe in his own excitement because he has himself turned it on and evades the conflict with the aid of ambiguity. The mechanism of rage plays its part here. Anyone who has decided to become excited simply has to screw up his eyes and clench his teeth. Such reflections, like many of those with a direct bearing on society, seriously raise the question of how far the psychoanalytical distinction between the conscious and the unconscious is really appropriate anymore. It assumes that the individual possesses a monadological density and autonomy that have simply ceased to exist. In order to repress anything, you must start by having an ego. The present mass reactions, for which musical reactions stand as the model, are only separated from the consciousness by a thin veil. This veil should be broken through, but this is the very thing which is almost impossible to achieve. In fact, subjectively, the truth is no longer so completely unconscious. The position is comparable to that of ideology, which objective praxis is beginning to replace with lies. This would require a modification of the thesis that spontaneity is being ousted by the blind acceptance of whatever is being forced upon you. Even the belief that nowadays people behave like insects, transforming themselves into mere centers of obedience, is still just part of the facade. Such a notion is grist to the mill of all those who talk a lot of nonsense about the revival of myth. We should say rather that spontaneity is being eroded by the enormous efforts which are imposed on people by their very acquiescence in what is imposed, just because the veil which surrounds that imposition has become so thin. In order to be a jitterbug and to become enthusiastic about what is forced upon you, it is by no means enough to surrender yourself and toe the line passively. For people to be transformed into insects, they require as much energy as might well suffice to turn them into human beings. Right, so I mentioned the appeal of music, or the appeal of any art form, or the appeal of any ideological phenomenon. There's also the question of what people are doing. What are they doing with the work of art? What are they doing with the listening experience? What are they doing with music? How is music being used? How are people using it? Why are they using it the way that they're using it? Right, so they're using it to turn themselves into insects instead of turning themselves into human beings. And they're doing that actively. It's not happening to them, it's not passive, it's active. I think that we talked about this in terms of experience, that in German there are two words for experience, one that suggests the passive and one that suggests the active character of it. So something happening to you versus something that you yourself are doing. All right, so that's where the fetish character in music kind of begins. It begins with that question and that phenomenon. So the title of this essay, Fetish Character in Music and the Regression of Listening. So he was just invoking a little bit of psychoanalysis, a little bit of Freudian psychoanalysis. However, here the fetish is not the psychoanalytic fetish. It's not the substitute object, the substitute gratification. It's not the one object that displaces the other object. Rather, the fetish character is the commodity fetishism. It's the commodity character. The regression of listening, however, that's the psychoanalytic part. That's the Freudian part. The regression of listening, but in two different respects. So there's the psychological and there's the societal. So we've encountered this idea that society is regressing, Rosa Luxemburg, barbarism. So regression of listening at an individual psychological level, infantilized listening, in that psychoanalytic sense, but also historically regressive listening, meaning art has liberated itself in the bourgeois era as a commodity, music has liberated itself, however it's regressing back into a kind of traditional ritual, cultural function. Again, Susan Buckmore's first week of class, the opposition of art and culture. Right, so visual culture liquidates art, meaning art emancipated itself from culture, but under capitalism is regressing back into culture. And part of that has to do with the regression of the subject. This is the connection between historical regression and psychological regression. The regression of the subject back into a kind of objective condition. There's a kind of an abdication of the subject. So one of the things that music allows people to do, turning themselves into insects instead of human beings, it allows them to regress psychologically. It also allows them to participate in societal regression. It allows them to be part of a mindless, ritualized collective at the expense of their individual subjectivity. All right, so let's see how he thematizes that in the beginning of this piece. It says, complaints about the decline of musical taste begin only a little later than mankind's twofold discovery on the threshold of historical time, that music represents at once the immediate manifestation of impulse and the locus of its taming. Yeah, there's a lot packed into that first sentence. So decline of musical taste means people are losing the ability to exercise the faculty of taste, in the bourgeois sense of each person having their own individual taste. So everyone has the faculty of taste, but each one, to each his own, everyone has their own taste. Nonetheless, one can talk about, or people did talk about, a decline of taste, not only in music, but in other domains. So that would be something that happens at an individual level, but seems to be more of a collective condition. So mankind's twofold discovery on the threshold of historical time, what is that? All right, so threshold of historical time. This is a little bit of a little Marxist thing. So one is, he's going to refer back to civilization, consciousness of civilizations. He's going to invoke Plato, and invoke classical antiquity. And what comes before that kind of ancient enlightenment moment is prehistorical. It seems prehistorical, antediluvian, prehistorical. So there's a threshold of historical time in the sense that history begins with civilization. Written history. If you remember, history is the history of class struggle, but then Engels is like, that's written history, because, of course, the Paleolithic hunter-gatherers don't have class struggle. Okay, so civilization has class struggle, it has history. But then there's another respect of history. Actually, there are two more. One more would be the bourgeois emancipation, the bourgeois enlightenment. That would be what casts behind it, everything behind it, into a kind of ancient prehistory. Then there's the Marxist idea that we're still living in prehistory, meaning that capitalism is the last phase of prehistory, and that overcoming capitalism will be the leap from the animal kingdom into the realm of humanity, and the beginning of true human history. So there are kind of three moments of enlightenment. If you recall, we looked at the Louis Menand introduction to the Finland Station, the little summary of Marxism. Marx and Engels as philosophers of a second enlightenment. And why would there need to be a second enlightenment? Because of capitalism. So there would be a bourgeois enlightenment, and then there would be a second enlightenment required by the problem of capitalism. So of course, all three are coming together. The discovery on the threshold of historical time that music represents at once the immediate manifestation of impulse and the locus of its taming. So what does that mean? It means that music seems to express our own emotions, but it also seems to elicit those emotions. So music is both the effect and the cause of our emotions, or impulses, is the way he puts it. But it also gives our emotions form. And in giving it form, it not only elicits or manifests the impulse, but tames it or disciplines it. And we'll see at the end of the essay how he comes back around to the disciplinary function of music. He says, music stirs up the dance of the Maenads and sounds from Pan's bewitching flute, but it also rings out from the Orphic lyre around which the visions of violence range themselves pacified. Whenever their peace seems to be disturbed by the bacchantic agitation, there is talk of the decline of taste. But if the disciplining function of music has been handed down since Greek philosophy as a major good, then certainly the pressure to be permitted to obey, musically as elsewhere, is today more general than ever. Just as the current musical consciousness of the masses can scarcely be called Dionysian, so he's got the Maenads, he's got Pan, he's got Orpheus, now he's got Dionysus. right? So again, the kind of orgiastic character of music, the fact that it sets our emotions free. But he's saying that's not really the experience or the consciousness of the masses today. So its latest changes, right, the changes in the musical consciousness of the masses, have nothing to do with taste. And so it seems like the bourgeois categories of taste no longer apply. So how? Why? The concept of taste is itself outmoded. Responsible art adjusts itself to criteria which approximate judgments. So taste is a judgment. And so the idea is that the faculty of taste is a function of the faculty of judgment. So approximate judgments. The harmonious and the inharmonious. The correct and the incorrect. But otherwise, no more choices are made. The question is no longer put, and no one demands the subjective justification of the conventions. So taste and judgment seem to no longer apply. The very existence of the subject who could verify such taste, who could exercise such judgment, has become as questionable as has, at the opposite pole, the right to a freedom of choice, which empirically, in any case, no one any longer exercises. If one seeks to find out who likes a commercial piece, one cannot avoid the suspicion that liking and disliking are inappropriate to the situation, even if the person questioned clothes his reactions in those words. The familiarity of the piece is a surrogate for the quality ascribed to it. In other words, we don't so much like or dislike things as much as we're familiar or unfamiliar with things. To like it is almost the same thing as to recognize it. An approach in terms of value judgments has become a fiction for the person who finds himself hemmed in by standardized musical goods. He can neither escape impotence nor decide between the offerings where everything is so completely identical that preference, in fact, depends merely on biographical details or on the situation in which things are heard. The categories of autonomously oriented art have no applicability to the contemporary reception of music. Not even for that of the serious music, domesticated under the barbarous name of classical, so as to enable one to turn away from it again in comfort. If it is objected that specifically light music and everything intended for consumption have in any case never been experienced in terms of those categories, that must certainly be conceded. Nevertheless, such music is also affected by the change in that the entertainment, the pleasure, the enjoyment it promises is given only to be simultaneously denied. In one of his essays, Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World, has raised the question of who, in a place of amusement, is really being amused. With the same justice, it can be asked whom music, for entertainment, still entertains. Rather, it seems to complement the reduction of people to silence, the dying out of speech as expression, the inability to communicate at all. It inhabits the pockets of silence that develop between people molded by anxiety, work, and undemanding docility. Everywhere it takes over unnoticed the deadly sad role that fell to it in the time of the specific situation of the silent films. It is perceived purely as background. If nobody can any longer speak, then certainly nobody can any longer listen. An American specialist in radio advertising, who indeed prefers to make use of the musical medium, has expressed skepticism as to the value of this advertising because people have learned to deny their attention to what they are hearing even while listening to it. His observation is questionable with respect to the advertising value of music, but it tends to be right in terms of the reception of the music itself. Okay, so let's unpack this. Because he brings in Plato, so he invoked Nietzsche and Plato early on. And Plato wanted to ban all music except military music. So basically, Plato wanted to ban all art in the Republic. And the only art that he wanted to keep was music, but only military music. Right, because it was necessary for social discipline. All right, so I actually have an anecdote that I like to use to describe a lot of what he's talking about here. So the anecdote is from when I was a student here at SAIC. When I was a grad student, I was an MFA student here at SAIC. And I went with some of my friends to see a premiere performance at the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, which is just up the block. It's across the street, across Adams. And we went to see a premiere performance of a work commissioned by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra from a post-Soviet, because after the fall of the Soviet Union, she was a composer in the Soviet Union, composer Sofia Gubidalina, who kind of a modernist, again, late Soviet and post-Soviet composer. They had a program where they had her piece, which was a chamber symphony, and then it was followed by Stravinsky's Firebird suite. So Firebird Ballet, a suite of music from Firebird as the second half. So the musical director at the time is a very famous conductor and musician, Daniel Barenboim. He was the musical director at the CSO for a while. So we went. We went on student tickets. We went student discount tickets. We went, just dressed casually. But it was a premiere performance, so it was a big social event for the rich people, for the patrons of the CSO, for the season ticket holders, and for the big donors of the CSO. Usually when me and my friends, or really when you go to see like classical music performed, one of the things that you do is you listen to a record before you go. You listen to the music on CD and then you go. So you prepare yourself for the live performance by listening to a recording. This is a premiere, so that was not possible. It was not possible to do that. So what that meant was that the experience was overwhelming. It was completely overwhelming. It was kind of awesome. And, we were, really into it because we like her music. And so we were going to like it no matter what. And at the end, we stood, me and my friends gave it a standing ovation. But then we suddenly noticed that not everyone was standing. People were clapping politely, but actually only some people were giving it a standing ovation. Even though the woman had come all the way over from Russia, an old woman come all the way over from Russia, and they gave her a big reception, they gave her a huge bouquet of flowers. I remember the flowers were the bouquet of flowers was bigger than she was on the stage. They didn't give it a standing ovation. Okay. Intermission between the two halves of the night's entertainment is basically, it's a bathroom break, but it's also where you can go get a drink. Like they have a bar on each level, right? And so we overheard the patrons talking about what they had just experienced. And they were a little bit mystified, and they were like, oh, that was grotesque, and they kind of giggled nervously. And then I was like, well, Daniel must know what he's doing because he's so brilliant, and so he must have known that this woman's work is important, and that's why they commissioned this new piece from her and did this premiere performance. It must be good, even though we didn't like it. Right. Filed back into our seats for the second half of the performance. The Firebird Suite by Stravinsky, and as one of my friends I was there with said, oh, this is an old warhorse, the orchestra could perform this in their sleep. That got a standing ovation. That got the standing ovation from everyone. Because it's like, that's music. We know what that is. That's music, right? The first half, we don't know what the hell that is. Like, it's kind of like, okay, but nah, I'm not sure if that's music or not music, right? So what Adorno describes here in this essay as the pleasure is not from the music, it's from the price of the ticket. Calls it the pleasure of the price of the ticket. Right? Why? Because why do people go to the CSO? Why do people become season ticket holders of the CSO? Why do they become donors, patrons of the CSO? In order to feel cultured and to feel that they're participating in culture and that they're upholding culture. That these are people who like music and therefore want to help sustain music and therefore become patrons of the CSO. Whereas on the other hand, me and my friends, we're like artists and we're bohemians and we're like, punky kids. And so of course we have the much more romantic notion of like, well, we really appreciate this music, not these rich people, right, whose money is the only reason why it exists, the only reason why the CSO exists, the only reason why the music exists. So we, who have nothing, we have this kind of romantic idea of like, we know what the real value of music is, but it's dependent on people who have enough money to keep it going and who almost necessarily have no connection to like contemporary music or new music, right? They're only keeping a kind of antiquated, museumified notion of music alive. Right, that's why they want to hear the Stravinsky. Right, so that's a kind of big divorce within music itself. Right. So we didn't pay for the ticket, but in some ways we were also experiencing the pleasure of the music as a function of the price of the ticket. Right. Meaning, the two notions of culture, the kind of museumified, whereas our notion of like, well, no, of course it's got to be avant-garde music, new music, cutting edge, like contemporary music. It's good, that they really partake of the same thing, even though they seem to be completely counterposed to each other. Then eventually it was released on CD, and then I listened to it, and I felt like I was really able to listen to it for the first time. Because, of course, listening in a domestic environment, you have control over, when it starts, when it stops, you can listen to it again. That allows for listening in a way that the actual live performance, which used to be the only way to listen to music, is too much. It's kind of overwhelming. It's overwhelming for us, who thought it was awesome. It was overwhelming for the patrons, who, again, couldn't make sense of it. Could only make sense of the idea of music as a cultural good that they abstractly support. Okay, so how does that show up in a more granular level for Adorno? If we think about what music is the art of sound. One of the things that annoys me here at SAIC is that there's not a music department, there's a sound department. What the hell is that? And the students in the sound department, of course, are all musicians, and they're all actually classically trained musicians, but they don't make music anymore. They make sound art. So what would it mean for music, which is the art of sound, to revert back to sound? Right, that would be what Adorno is tracking here. So this is where the reification of music involves its reversion to sound, where what matters to people is less the composition, the construction. So in the bourgeois ideal of music, the classical ideal, the sonata form, the music is constructed by the listener in the listening experience. So the composer composes a work. They have a very spare score that allows for a great deal of interpretation by the performers. The performers perform the music and are constructing the music out of the score and out of their own listening experience, what makes sense to them based on the score. Then the listeners are also constructing the work in their listening. And there's a kind of democratic kind of parity between the composer, the performers, and the listeners, where one can feel like one is actually having an experience that one is participating in. So music is a listening experience that one is actively participating in, actively constructing and making sense of the music, and that the music is composed in such a way as to allow us to kind of analyze and construct it as we listen to it. That seems to have gone away in favor of listening to its sound qualities. So we listen to the voices of the instruments, whether of a human vocalist or of a especially great piano or especially great violin or especially great cello, right? The kind of quality of the sound. And we also listen to not the kind of basic composition, but we listen to the sonorities, the subharmonics, we listen to the texture. So we listen to the sound, we listen to its texture. We're much less involved in analyzing, constructing, reconstructing, taking apart, putting back together the harmonies and the melodies. And again, that started with Wagner, right? That's the sort of modernist. And so the idea is that Wagner didn't do it. He rather expressed something about a new kind of listening experience that's actually a crisis of the listening experience. So music reverts to sound, and then the question is, well, sound in what respect? So sound in a reified sense, meaning sound becomes like a thing. It's not a phenomenon of aesthetic form that is subjective as well as objective, but rather appears to be an objective phenomenon, a kind of reified thing. The scores across the 19th century and into the 20th century become much more exact and precise and much more thoroughly kind of hyper-notated, like had instruction on how to play, like very fine-grained details about the performance. So in the same way that the recording stands in for the live performance, the score can also stand in for the music itself. So it seems like the idea of the music, the kind of plan for it, is the real thing, and then the performance is the sort of imperfect version of it. So what we want from a performance, we want a high-fidelity recording of sound recording. What we want from a performance is an accurate performance. So the room for interpretation by the performers is reduced. And similarly, the room for interpretation in the listening is reduced. So it seems to be much more about technical precision than about aesthetic judgment or taste. Right? So one would expect a conductor of a symphony or a performer of a work, a musician, to interpret the music according to their own taste. And then the audience would respond to that. So the audience would exercise judgment in response to the performer's judgment. And the role of the composer would be to sort of make that possible rather than determine it ahead of time, in the sense of programming the entire experience ahead of time. The music increasingly, and starting with Wagner, becomes something that the composer is determining ahead of time. And you're losing that ability to have any kind of exercise of judgment or play of interpretation by the performers and by the listeners. So music itself is kind of reified in that sense. And yet it still remains music. It still remains recognizably the bourgeois art form. We still listen to it. At one level, we still listen to it as bourgeois listeners. It isn't fully dissolved into culture. That's another function of its reification. It still remains separate from society and contradictory to the society. And again, that's why he has to say it fills in the silence. Well, you could say, well, maybe music always filled in the silence. But no, he's describing something else, meaning the silence that it fills in is different. And the way it fills in the silence is different. So the pomp and circumstance, the divertissement of the court music, or the religious music might have filled the silence, but neither the silence nor what it means to fill that silence were the same as they are now. Let me jump ahead here to the end, because this will be an important kind of thought figure that he brings in. And he describes that change on the part of the listener, this kind of reification of music, again, in two ways, historical and psychological. So historical, it seems like modern society and capitalism gives us less ability and gives us less subjective capacity to want to do this kind of active listening. Historically, again, the reversion of music back into a thing, rather than the bourgeois art form it had become when it had liberated itself. So let's see how he describes this effect overall. In the face of regressive listening, music as a whole begins to take on a comic aspect. One need only listen to the uninhibited sonority of a choral rehearsal from outside. This experience was caught with great force in a film by the Marx Brothers, who demolish an opera set as if to clothe in allegory the insight of the philosophy of history on the decay of the operatic form, or in a most estimable piece of refined entertainment, break up a grand piano in order to take possession of its strings in their frame as the true harp of the future on which to play a prelude. Music has become comic in the present phase, primarily because something so completely useless is carried on with all the visible signs of the strain of serious work. By being alien to solid people, music reveals their alienation from one another, and the consciousness of alienation vents itself in laughter. In music, or similarly in lyric poetry, the society which judged them comic becomes comic. But involved in this laughter is the decay of the sacral spirit of reconciliation. All music today can sound very easily like Parsifal did to Nietzsche's ear. It recalls incomprehensible rites and surviving masks from an earlier time and is provocative nonsense. Okay, so all music today is provocative nonsense. The radio, which both wears out music and overexposes it, makes a major contribution to this. Perhaps a better hour may at some time strike even for the clever fellows, one in which they may demand, instead of prepared material ready to be switched on, the improvisatory displacement of things as the sort of radical beginning that can only thrive under the protection of the unshaken real world. Even discipline can take over the expression of free solidarity if freedom becomes its content. As little as regressive listening is a symptom of progress in consciousness of freedom, that's a Hegel phrase, it could suddenly turn around if art, in unity with the society, should ever leave the road of the always identical. In other words, overcome capitalism. Not popular music, but artistic music has furnished a model for this possibility. It is not for nothing that Mahler, so Mahler would have been a musician, a composer, he was previous to the Second Viennese School. So he's late 19th, early 20th century, but he's a sort of forefather for that. It's not for nothing that Mahler is the scandal of all bourgeois musical aesthetics. They call him uncreative because he suspends their concept of creation itself. Everything with which he occupies himself is already there. He accepts it in its vulgarized form. His themes are expropriated ones. Nevertheless, nothing sounds as it was wont to. All things are diverted as if by a magnet. What is worn out yields pliantly to the improvising hand. The used parts win a second life as variants, just as the chauffeur's knowledge of his old second-hand car can enable him to drive it punctually and unrecognized to its intended destination. so can the expression of a beat-up melody, straining under the pressure of clarinets and oboes in the upper register, arrive at places which the approved musical language could never safely reach. Such music really crystallizes the whole into which it has incorporated the vulgarized fragments into something new. Yet it takes its material from regressive listening. But if Mahler stood athwart the concept of musical progress, neither can the new and radical music, whose most advanced practitioners give allegiance to him in a seemingly paradoxical way, any longer be subsumed exclusively under the concept of progress. It proposes to consciously resist the phenomenon of regressive listening. The terror which Schoenberg and Webern spread today as in the past comes not from their incomprehensibility, but from the fact that they are all too correctly understood. Their music gives form to that anxiety, that terror, that insight into the catastrophic situation which others merely evade by regressing. They are called individualists, and yet their work is nothing but a single dialogue with the powers which destroy individuality. Powers whose formless shadows fall gigantically on their music. In music, too, collective powers are liquidating an individuality past saving, but against them, only individuals are capable of consciously representing the aims of collectivity. Okay. All right, so he sort of turns it around at the end, which is that the fact that we use music to discipline ourselves in capitalism suggests the possibility of its opposite. And even the regressive aspects of music, the way they play out under capitalism, could play out in a very different way. Right, so he's not really calling for a return to the earlier bourgeois classical form, but rather he's looking at how the modernist music points beyond itself. So Mahler pre-World War I, Second Viennese School post-World War I. That would be one way of thinking about it. So again, kind of high modernism and then the crisis and the late modernism of the 20th century. Right, so where Mahler could do a kind of playful, optimistic pastiche of what music had become in capitalism, then it becomes this kind of anxious terror in the hands of the later modernists. And it's important that it's not out of incomprehension, but out of being comprehended, being understood. Meaning the masses don't reject modernism because they don't understand it, they reject it because they do understand it. One of the themes in the essay as a whole is that we're actually more sophisticated as listeners now than people were back in Mozart and Beethoven's time. So it's not that we're less sophisticated, we're actually more sophisticated because we're inundated with music, and we're not only inundated with music, but we're inundated with modernist music. I'll say something about jazz because Adorno's a little bit notorious when it comes to jazz. So he saw in his Weimar Republic Germany people who had been raised in the quote unquote classical tradition in modernist music before World War I, eagerly embracing jazz as a kind of escape hatch. So he sees it as a kind of an avoidance of the problem. So it seems like modernism reached a crescendo around the time of World War I, and then afterwards people were eager to escape that crisis. And one of the ways that they did so was through jazz. And that jazz is a kind of self-irony when it comes to music. And it's in the form of a commodified folk music, right? So it's basically the slave music developed by Black Americans that then turns into a kind of a principle of commodifiable music in the 20th century. So he does consider jazz to be a form of modernism, and it's kitsch in terms of what we'll be reading next week, only insofar as it is mass popular. And again, the popularity in Europe, it's first popular among rich people in Europe. And what they want is not just any jazz, they want authentic jazz. So what does that mean? It means that there's a whole market for Black American jazz performers in Europe. Kind of famously, you probably guys have heard about this. Which is also a kind of interesting outlet for Black Americans to escape like Jim Crow segregation. And they're able to live and work in Europe in less onerous conditions than in the United States. But part of what happens with jazz is, again, a different relationship between music and time. So syncopation and even tempo, the marching band rhythm of jazz, and then the fact that it's jazz standards and then it's improvisation. But for Adorno, it's improvisation that's hemmed in within a very strict framework. So it's a kind of, the appeal of jazz is as a kind of false emancipation. And that's the basis of his criticism of jazz, is that it offers a kind of false emancipation that's really about submission to the kind of everyday rhythms of capitalist society. That's another way of thinking about freedom and discipline, the way he ends this essay, is that it's freedom, but within very hemmed-in, narrow confines, and really its overwhelming power is through discipline. Now, of course, our pop music, and pop music in the 20th century more generally, has been jazzified. Like, that has just happened. So it's totally naturalized. So what makes jazz what it is not the music, it's the listener. So he wrote an essay when the Nazis banned jazz. The Nazis, when they took power, they banned jazz. And he wrote an essay about this, saying it kind of doesn't matter that the Nazis banned jazz because jazz is so pervasive that it can't be banned. Meaning everyone's going to play everything as if it's jazz anyway, and everyone's going to listen to everything as if it's jazz anyway. So this kind of Nazi, kind of racist attempt to expunge African or Black and American culture out of Germany was kind of futile because it was already built into the listening experience. All right. Doing for time. Well, we're very late. All right, let's take a break and then we'll come back and we'll look at some of the notes, the discussion notes. Okay, so Jimeng, did you want to say anything about the notes? Jimeng? No? Okay, anybody have any points you'd like to raise with the readings for this week on music? I think that I had asked you guys before, who has background in music? You do? Mm-hmm. Yeah, music can be an obscure, especially Adorno uses some technical language that can kind of get in the way, but it's not the. Generally, these readings don't have too much technical language to obscure the argument. So one thing that, of course, didn't quite exist in Adorno's time, and yet is now pervasive, is like the personal music player, right? So, he's living through the time of music, we might say, like mall music and elevator music and that kind of thing, which has gone out of style. So now you don't really, maybe mall music is still there, but elevator music is not really the case anymore. In terms of a kind of everyday reality, public space, kind of music filling in the silence, but also serving as a kind of a shield against anxiety. And the reason for that is that people, of course, do that with their individual music players instead. So everybody's on their headphones, and so that's how people play music in their cars when they're driving. So that's how we instead use music to allay our terror, our anxiety, how we fill the silence. So music is now, you can hear it anytime, any place you want, right, which is peculiar. But we also now have, in the form of our smartphones, the ability to also see images anytime, any place. So we can hear music anytime, any place. We can see images anytime, any place. And in many respects, that was already anticipated. The desire for that was already the case in the 19th century. So what we have is a kind of technically perfected, as well as socially and culturally shaped set of forms that seemed to have already been desired and were suggested at much earlier points in history. The danger being that naturalizes it. In other words, it seems like, we have these things because people always wanted these things, and then technology just made those things possible that we always wanted anyway. Well, maybe we didn't always want to be able to hear music anytime, any place. Maybe the fact that music could only be heard at certain times in certain places, maybe that's all that people wanted. Maybe people in the Middle Ages or even in the 1800s didn't want iPods. I guess iPods don't exist anymore. So people just do it through their phones. So do it through the all-purpose mini computer. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It just brings to light very interesting ideas or thoughts about, especially nowadays, like you're saying, you have it all on the tips of your fingers, but originally it was never really intended to be that.
That's right. Yeah.
And it also kind of makes me think too, pre-recorded music and or music that was made before you could record it, music that's made now, like how they might be inherently different from one another because one was made to be recorded and one was not made to be recorded.
That's right. So one of the things that he raises with the curves of the needle as well as the form of the phonograph record is how the recorded music medium is trying to reproduce the live performance, and yet it can't. It compresses the sound. It really changes not only the auditory object, but obviously it changes the general kind of physical presence, like he talks about the presence of the body of the singer. Now, we also had another piece, the Radio Symphony, that I didn't list on the syllabus because there were so many readings to begin with. if you see a symphony performed live, the instruments are such that the sound, like it sort of resonates in your body. You don't only hear the sound with your ears, you hear it with your body. Whether it's the sort of bass instruments of all kinds, really, it's like a kind of physical experience that you can't get through headphones. And you also can't get really through hi-fi speakers either. It's very difficult to reproduce apart from the actual live performance. And yet we do find the kind of simulacrum acceptable, and then music becomes that. So with the radio symphony, what he talks about is how symphonies become whistleable tunes, right? They become little catchy melodies, whereas in fact symphonies don't function that way. They're not really meant to be listened to that way, and yet that's what they're turned into. They're turned into kind of raw material for pop song kind of listening. Now, you guys know there's the famous John Cage piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. It's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. So where does that time come from? It comes from the side of a record. That's actually what the length of a pop song comes from. Right? So popular music, folk music, like our kind of 4 minute something pieces of music that we're used to, that was not the case. Right, so now, like a song is, our expectations. The 32 bar structure also, and the way it kind of recapitulates, that was shaped by the recording medium. And so the question is, okay, does the technology change our experience, or had our experience already been changed in such a way that technology met it? Because obviously they could have done all sorts of things with sound recording technology and media of reproduction. But they settled on first the 78 record, then the 45 record, and finally the 33 record. That's how vinyl evolved. And they settled on that form because it seemed appropriate to what people wanted. It seemed appropriate to the musical experience itself. So there had to have been a change structure in our subjectivity to allow recorded music to make sense in the way that it did. Similarly, when we were talking about photography, we're apt to ascribe to the technology a change in our subjectivity, meaning that photography did this, changed the way we saw things. Whereas in fact, we needed to have already been looking at things differently. We already had to be different kinds of viewing subjects for photography to have had an appeal to people, for it to have made sense, for it to have caught on as a medium. And especially the Benjamin piece, The Little History of Photography, that we read last time. Pardon me. His point was that photography was always intended to be what it became. So even when technologically it couldn't be the snapshot, it wanted to be the snapshot. So even though it only technically got there in the late 19th century, at the point of its invention in the early 19th century, it already wanted to become that. In this respect, music, in its composition, also in its live performance, already wanted to be the music of a sound recording even before the invention of sound recording. Otherwise, we would not have invented the medium. Right, so the question is, why did we invent the medium to begin with? At the historical moment when we did. What was motivating that invention? We tend to reify technology, ascribe a kind of agency to technology, but in fact, it's ourselves that made the change. It wasn't the technology that made the change. We made the change, and we invented the technology in order to bring the change about.
Makes me think about AI music is a whole thing right now. It's like everybody,
I'm horrified.
a lot of people are sitting there saying, is it music? How does this work? Go down the rabbit hole.
Uh-huh.
Almost makes me think like, how does this work?
So in their time, so we're reading pretty early Adorno, but already 12-tone serial music, serial, serial music, had a kind of programmed quality to it. And then computer music did come pretty quickly after World War II. So he's already living in the time of computer music, certainly in the time of electronic music. So he complains in The Curves of the Needle in the form of the phonograph record that musicians, composers are not taking advantage of the medium. They're not composing for the medium. And instead the medium is used just to give us a recording of what could be made anyway. Now, of course, that changed. So it did become the case that music was performed, recorded, composed for the recording medium itself. Where the live performance, so I always like to say this, like, you know, I was into like electronic music, new wave music, you know, that what was sad was how difficult it was for the bands to reproduce the record live, right? So it's the opposite. It's not does the record reproduce the live performance, but rather does the live performance reproduce the record, the experience of the record. They've actually gotten better about that. Like it's improved a great deal over time, sort of shockingly. So he did live in the time of computer music and also aleatory. I mentioned John Cage, like aleatory compositional techniques. So basically, whether mathematical formula or other kinds of gimmicks to produce music that no one would think to compose. Like no human being would sort of think to compose. So you could say that already suggested AI music. I have a feeling, though, that AI music is probably far less interesting than that. Like, far less interesting than the sort of little random generators that the composers in the mid-20th century came up with, or the sort of synthetic kind of devices that they use to kind of automatically generate music, or generate music according to either mathematical formula or like technical, so electronic music, a lot of composers, a lot of musicians, they built their own things. They engineered their own instruments. And I just have a feeling, in other words, they engineered the devices that then produced sound that maybe was not exactly what was intended, right? So I have a feeling that AI music, like AI-generated art, it's far less interesting, actually. Right? It's just some like really weird version of like kitsch or something, So, which again suggests, well, you have all this computing power, it could be something entirely different, and yet it's this.
It's all created via prompts
Uh-huh.
from the people based on their subjective. Like in the sense, it almost has to be something similar to what's already happening.
Yeah. And it's like the large language model. It's the kind of data crunching, right? So it's just the sort of lowest common denominator of music, the way AI art is like the lowest common denominator of art. But of course, we've designed it to be that, right? So in other words, we could use this technology in all sorts of ways, but we're using it this way. Right? It's kind of it's remarkable that way. So. Again, what Adorno is talking about, the abdication of freedom, the abdication of creativity. Even the abdication of technical possibilities, right? Even allowing the non-human to kind of free itself from the human criteria, which, again, the avant-garde composers, like the electronic composers of the 20th century, like really went pretty far in that direction, but we seem to have shrunk back from it. I don't know how it ended exactly. I guess it ended with like Philip Glass or something. Do you guys know who Philip Glass is? Yeah. Brian Eno is kind of an interesting case. He's an interesting case. I like his stuff, but then also I wonder whether he kind of stopped at a certain point. Not just as a function of age, but as a function of like lack of imagination. Right. So, So keeping in mind again, it's a function of the listener. It's a function of the viewer. It's a function of what we want as viewers and listeners. It's a function of how we're using the technology, and also what we're using art, or in this case music, for. How are we listening? What is the listening experience about for us? And so the disparity between the possibilities, both in terms of the aesthetic education that we have in the culture that we inhabit, but also other things like the technical possibilities and the possibilities of the medium. So one example that I always like to use, so I guess it's related to the AI music or AI art case, which is, the internet was supposed to be, hypertextual, it was supposed to be participatory, it was supposed to be democratic, it was supposed to sort of generate all sorts of new possibilities and new forms, and instead it just became a kind of transmission medium for the same old stuff. Right, so I think that Susan Buck-Morse again mentioned that back in 1996. She said, the idea of computer screens replacing televisions might mean a lot to like telephone companies, or cable companies, telecommunications companies, but will it, really change our experience of the image? Other than reducing it in some way to the what the digital can do. Right? Even when it has a kind of high fidelity to the analog, it's still, we've still accepted that sort of threshold of the digitized, which is different. When I first started teaching here, we still use slide projectors. And sometimes the slides were natty, sometimes they were bad. But often they were better than what I can project from artworks through the computer. So in my other class, in the Benjamin course that I'm teaching, the grad seminar on Walter Benjamin, we're about to read The Task of the Translator, and he has a kind of catchphrase there that suddenly comes to mind, which is that no poem is written for the reader, no painting is painted for the viewer, no music is composed for the listener. Okay, so that's like a paradoxical statement. What does that mean? Well, it suggests two things. One is that, again, one of the things that Adorno emphasizes here is the imminent possibilities of the form. That part of what's going on with modernism is that musicians are really taking the form itself to its limits and leaving the listener behind in that respect. But the other is that, in fact, one is aiming to change the reader, change the viewer, change the listener. So the reason that a poem isn't written for the reader is because the poem is actually trying to produce the reader that it wants, rather than taking the already existing reader as its starting point. And similarly, the painting might be trying to create a new viewer rather than the pre-existing one, and music might be trying to create a new listener. And yet, that's precisely what it seems to be shrunk back from. Right, so there seems to be a disparity between the possibility and the reality in these domains. Now, I mentioned that Romanticism In some respects, modernism remains romanticism, in the sense that romanticism, it is a crisis of the classical, in a sense of the loss of the classical, a sense of the loss of a kind of easy fluency of the canon, such that art can just build unproblematically on the prior history, and that therefore the romantic tends to point to something rather than be able to actually do it. It seems to suggest something rather than actually accomplishing it. And modernism remains like that. I think that we talked about this earlier in the course, the idea of the fragment, because we looked at the archaic torso of Apollo on the first day of class, and that there are two ways of thinking about the fragment. The fragment could be something that was once whole that is now broken, or the fragment could be something that's incomplete, that's kind of interrupted midway, that's not fully realized. And so modernism could be seen as, like romanticism, could be seen as a phenomenon of a broken tradition, or it could be seen as a kind of incomplete process, sort of caught midway. I think that when we read the Trotsky, he also put it this way, that Trotsky said that the art movements move on rapidly from one to the next without reaching a full development. Right, that since the mid-19th century, art history has had this quality. You could also say literary history has had this quality, musical history has had this quality, that there seems to be an eruption of possibility that then is cut short. And indeed, the reason for looking at it that way is because capitalism is like that. Capitalism is generating all sorts of possibilities which it quickly leaves behind before fully realizing them. So if you recall from the beginning of On the Social Situation of Music by Adorno, he says that this society can only absorb fragments and ruins of the music. That's another kind of Marxist idea. The other Marxist idea, which I think we have in the To the Planetarium. Maybe we didn't do it. Did we do the To the Planetarium that I've been reading? Maybe we did not. The idea that the Marxist idea is that capitalism is a pathology of our inability to socially appropriate the possibilities of technology. It's an idea that we're going to return to when we read the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. But maybe let's look at To the Planetarium before we adjourn today. We did on the mimetic faculty. The non-sensuous similarity? Okay, good. This is from 1928. If one had to expound the teachings of antiquity with utmost brevity while standing on one leg, as did Hillel, that of the Jews, it could only be in this sentence: they alone shall possess the earth who live from the powers of the cosmos. Nothing distinguishes the ancient from the modern man so much as the former's absorption in a cosmic experience scarcely known to later periods. Its waning is marked by the flowering of astronomy at the beginning of the modern age. Kepler, Copernicus, and Tycho Brahe were certainly not driven by scientific impulses alone. All the same, the exclusive emphasis on an optical connection to the universe, to which astronomy very quickly led, contained a portent of what was to come. The ancients' intercourse with the cosmos had been different, the ecstatic trance. For it is in this experience alone that we gain certain knowledge of what is nearest to us and what is remotest from us, and never of one without the other. Again, presence as a matter of proximity and distance, the aura. This means, however, that man can only be in ecstatic contact with the cosmos communally, so by communing with it. It is the dangerous error of modern men to regard this experience as unimportant and avoidable, and to consign it to the individual as the poetic rapture of starry nights. It is not. Its hour strikes again and again, and then neither nations nor generations can escape it, as was made terribly clear by the last war. That's World War I, which was an attempt at new and unprecedented commingling with the cosmic powers. Human multitudes, gases, electrical forces were hurled into the open country. High-frequency currents coursed through the landscape. New constellations rose in the sky. Aerial space and ocean depths thundered with propellers. And everywhere, sacrificial shafts were dug in Mother Earth. This immense wooing of the cosmos was enacted for the first time on a planetary scale, that is, in the spirit of technology. But because the lust for profit of the ruling class sought satisfaction through it, technology betrayed man and turned the bridal bed into a bloodbath. The mastery of nature, so the imperialists teach, is the purpose of all technology. But who would trust a cane wielder who proclaimed the mastery of children by adults to be the purpose of education? Is not education above all the indispensable ordering of the relationship between generations, and therefore mastery, if we are to use this term, of that relationship, and not of children? And likewise, technology is the mastery of not nature, but of the relation between nature and man. Men as a species completed their development thousands of years ago, but mankind as a species is just beginning his. In technology, a phusis is being organized, that's a Greek word for nature, is being organized through which mankind's contact with the cosmos takes a new and different form from that which it had in nations and families. One need recall only the experience of velocities by virtue of which mankind is now preparing to embark on incalculable journeys into the interior of time, to encounter their rhythms from which the sick shall draw strength as they did earlier on high mountains or on the shores of southern seas. The Luna Parks are a prefiguration of sanatoria, so those are the amusement parks with roller coasters. That's what Luna Park is. The paroxysm of genuine cosmic experience is not tied to that tiny fragment of nature that we're accustomed to call nature. In the nights of annihilation of the last war, the frame of mankind was shaken by a feeling that resembled the bliss of the epileptic. And the revolts, actually the revolutions that followed it, were the first attempt of mankind to bring the new body under its control. The power of the proletariat is the measure of its convalescence. If it is not gripped to the very marrow by the discipline of this power, no pacifist polemics will save it. Living substance conquers the frenzy of destruction only in the ecstasy of procreation. So the use of the word technology is a little odd for us in English because they actually have three terms in German. They have techni, which is the old Greek word. They have technique, and then they have technology. So often they also have technics. So there's actually a fourth word. So we usually, by technology, we mean technique, what they would call technique or technics. Meaning we would call the smartphone a piece of technology. They would call it a piece of technics. So technology, on the other hand, the way they use the word in German, technology, it means the way we use technology. So it's not like the thing, it's rather what we do with it. Right, so it's how we use it. So techne is like any kind of tool or instrument. Technique or technics is like the form, and then how we relate to the form and use it overall in society and in culture, that would be technology. It would be the sort of logic of the technics. So we already kind of reify technology in the way that we use the word, because we just assume that the way we use things and what they are technically are identical. Whereas in German, it's problematized. Right, and of course, from the Marxist perspective that they have, that makes all the difference. Meaning the whole point with capitalism is that there's a disparity between the technical possibilities and the social relations that limit those possibilities. But see, Benjamin even sees the war, the destruction of World War I, as the suggestion of possibilities. In other words, not just as a horrific, catastrophe and crime and injury to humanity, but also it has a utopian dimension to it. like I said, this theme will come back when we look at the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, because he's going to interpret the futurists in these terms. Pardon me. Okay. I got volunteers for next time? Yes. Good. All right. So have a good weekend, have a good night, and I'll see you guys next week.